The snowstorm roared like a beast outside, its howling winds battering the sides of the truck as it crawled along the narrow road. Viktor Petrov pulled his coat tighter around himself, his breath fogging in the icy air. The driver, a burly man with a face half hidden by a thick scarf, didn't speak much. He gripped the wheel with both hands, his eyes darting between the windshield and the frozen forest beyond. "We're almost there," the driver muttered finally, his voice muffled. Viktor glanced at him but didn't respond. The journey had already taken them hours through a landscape devoid of life, save for the skeletal trees lining the road like silent watchers. Each passing mile seemed to weigh heavier on Viktor, though he couldn't say why. The prison loomed ahead, without warning, revealed by a flicker of headlights through the storm. A massive steel gate stood at the end of the road, flanked by high, frost-encrusted walls. Behind it, the hulking form of the prison itself rose like a shadow against the gray sky, its concrete walls stained and cracked. Viktor stepped out of the truck as it stopped, his boots crunching against the ice. The cold hit him like a hammer, a piercing chill that made him gasp despite his thick coat. A guard appeared from a small booth beside the gate, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Name?" he barked. "Viktor Petrov," Viktor replied, his voice steady. The guard nodded and motioned for him to follow. The gate groaned open, revealing the yard beyond. Snow swirled in the wind, and the bare flagpole in the center creaked ominously. Viktor couldn't help but glance up at the towering structure of the prison as he walked. Its windows were small and barred, their darkness broken only by the occasional flicker of light. The walls seemed to press inward, a weight that made his steps feel heavier with every passing second. Inside, the air was colder than he'd expected. The corridors were narrow, lined with peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights. Shadows stretched and shifted with each step, giving the illusion of movement where there was none. Viktor was led to the warden's office, a small room furnished with a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet. The warden himself sat behind the desk, a thin man with sunken cheeks and sharp eyes. He looked Viktor up and down before speaking. "Petrov," he said, motioning for him to sit. "Yes, sir," Viktor replied, taking the offered seat. The metal was freezing, and he felt the cold seeping through his pants. "You've been briefed, I assume?" the warden asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Viktor hesitated. "Not entirely, sir." The warden leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Site 331 isn't like other facilities," he said, his voice low. "You'll find that out soon enough. But I'll give you this piece of advice. Don't let the silence fool you. It's never truly quiet here." He handed Viktor a thin file, its cover marked with a faded seal. "Read this. It'll give you an idea of what you're dealing with." That night, Viktor sat alone in his small quarters, the file open on the desk before him. The reports inside were brief but chilling. Unexplained deaths. Inmates disappearing without a trace. Guards reporting strange occurrences during the long polar nights. One account described an inmate found frozen in his cell, though the heater had been running at full capacity. Another spoke of guards hearing whispers in empty corridors. Viktor closed the file, unease settling in his chest, like a stone. He had worked in corrections for years, but this was something else. The following morning, Viktor began his first patrol. The prison was quiet, unnervingly so. The inmates barely spoke, their eyes hollow and lifeless. Even the guards seemed subdued, their faces pale and drawn. Viktor tried to shake the feeling of unease, but it clung to him like a second skin. By his 3rd night, he had settled into a routine, though the oppressive atmosphere of the prison weighed heavier with each passing day. He was assigned to patrol the East Wing, the oldest part of the facility. The corridor was dimly lit, the flickering lights casting jagged shadows on the cracked walls. As he walked, his boots echoing on the concrete floor, he heard it, a faint scraping sound. He stopped, straining to listen. The sound was faint, but persistent, like nails on stone. "Who's there?" Victor called, his voice steady despite the chill running down his spine. There was no response, only the sound growing louder. He moved cautiously, his flashlight sweeping the hall. At the far end, he thought he saw something. A dark figure hunched in the corner. His breath caught, but when he blinked, the figure was gone. Victor shook his head, telling himself it was nothing. But the sensation of being watched lingered, prickling the back of his neck. The next day, Victor sought out one of the senior guards, a grizzled man named Sergei. "Have you ever seen anything strange here?" Victor asked, keeping his voice low. Sergei glanced around before answering. "You mean the shadows," he said, his tone barely above a whisper. Victor's stomach tightened. "So it's not just me." Sergei leaned closer, his expression grim. "This place isn't normal," he said. "There's something here, something that doesn't belong. It comes out during the polar nights, when the darkness lasts for months." Victor frowned. "What is it?" Sergei shook his head. "No one knows, but it's not human, that much is certain." That night, Victor couldn't sleep. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the wind outside. Around midnight, he heard it again. The scraping sound. This time, it was closer, just outside his door. He sat up, his pulse quickening. Grabbing his flashlight, he crept to the door and opened it. The corridor was empty, but the sound persisted, faint and rhythmic, coming from the direction of the east wing. Victor followed it, his footsteps cautious and deliberate. The sound led him to an old maintenance closet, its door slightly ajar. Inside, he found a hole in the wall, large enough for a man to crawl through. On the floor were scratch marks, as though something or someone had been dragged inside. Victor's breath caught in his throat. He backed away slowly, his flashlight shaking in his hand. Returning to his quarters, he locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of the scratch marks or the strange figure he thought he'd seen. Whatever was happening here, it was far from ordinary. The following morning, Victor's unease had not diminished. The memory of the scratch marks haunted him, and the whispers he thought he heard in the night lingered in his mind, like fragments of a half-forgotten nightmare. He decided to confront the warden. "There's something you're not telling me," Victor said, standing rigid in front of the warden's desk. The man looked up from his paperwork, his gaunt face betraying no emotion. "What do you think you've seen?" the warden asked, his voice calm but tinged with weariness. Victor hesitated. The scratches, the shadows, the whispers. They sounded absurd when spoken aloud. "Something is wrong with this place," Victor said finally. "I've worked in prisons for years, and I've never felt anything like this." The warden leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "Site 331 isn't like other facilities. It was built here for a reason most people would rather not think about." "What reason?" Victor demanded. The warden's lips tightened. "This prison wasn't built just to house criminals. It was meant to contain something."
The train screeched to a halt. The
Victor
sound
frowned,
of metal
his
grinding
pulse
against
quickening.
metal, splitting
"What
the
do you mean?"
frozen silence of the
The warden shook his
Siberian
head.
wilderness.
"You'll find out
I
soon
woke
enough.
with a start.
Just keep your head down
My
and do
body
your job."
aching from the
That's all
cold
the
and the
advice I can
cramped
give you.
position I'd been forced to endure for
Dissatisfied
what
but
felt
unwilling
like
to push
days.
further, Victor left the
Around me, the
office.
other prisoners stirred, their
thoughts
faces
racing.
pale and haggard in the dim
The
light
warden's
filtering
cryptic
through the
words
cracks in the freight car.
only deepened his sense of foreboding.
No one spoke. We
He
all
spent the
knew
rest
better.
of the day on edge,
A guard barked,
his every
voice
step
muffled but
accompanied
still
by the
sharp
feeling of
enough to
being
cut
watched.
through the din of
That
clinking
night,
chains.
Victor was assigned to patrol the central yard.
The doors slid open
polar
with a
night had
groan
descended
and an
fully
icy
now,
wind
shrouding the
howled
prison
in,
in
biting at
endless
our
darkness.
exposed skin.
The yard was vast and
One by
empty.
one we shuffled out of
towering
the
walls
car, our
stretching into the
breaths
void
turning
above.
to mist in the bitter
As
air.
Victor walked the perimeter,
My
his
boots
flashlight
hit the
casting
snow,
long beams of light across the
sinking
snow-covered ground.
slightly as I stepped
He
off
heard it
the
again.
train and into
faint
the
scraping
unforgiving landscape.
This time, It seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding him
Black
in
Hollow
stillness.
loomed ahead,
He stopped,
a hulking
straining
mass
to
of
listen.
iron and stone
breath
that seemed to
visible in the
rise
freezing
out
air.
of the snow like a
Then he
fortress,
saw it.
built to keep the
At
world
first,
out,
it was just a shadow,
or to keep something
flickering
in.
at the edge of his flashlight's
The
beam.
walls were high,
But as he
jagged,
turned, the shadow
and topped
grew,
with razor
its
wire,
form shifting and
their
writhing
edges
like
frosted
smoke.
with ice that gleamed
Victor's
in the
grip
pale
tightened on
light
his flashlight,
of the overcast
his heart pounding
sky.
in his chest.
Watchtowers dotted
"Who's
the
there?"
perimeter,
he called, his
their
voice breaking the
searchlights
silence.
sweeping lazily over the
The
desolate
shadow didn't
expanse.
respond.
Even from this
Instead,
distance, I could
it
see the
moved closer,
silhouettes of guards,
its shape growing more
perched
defined.
atop them,
It wasn't
rifles
human,
slung
that
over
much
their
was clear.
shoulders. The
Its
gates
movements were
groaned
jerky,
open, revealing a
unnatural,
courtyard packed with prisoners
marionette
hauling
controlled by
stones,
invisible
chopping
strings.
wood, and trudging
Victor
through the
backed
snow
away,
under the
his
watchful
breath
eyes
coming
of
in short
armed
gasps.
guards. The air
shadow
was thick
stopped,
with the smell of
lingering at the
sweat,
edge of the light,
smoke, and
as though
something
testing its
else.
boundaries.
Something metallic
And
and
then,
acrid that I couldn't
Just
place.
as suddenly,
My
as it had
stomach
appeared,
churned as I was herded
gone.
into a line with the others,
Victor
the
stood
weight of the
frozen
place
for a
settling
moment, his
over me
mind
like
racing.
a shroud.
When he
Another
finally
guard
moved,
shouted,
it was to sprint back
prodding the
inside
prisoner
prison,
in front of me with the
slamming
butt
the
of his
door behind
rifle.
him.
We shuffled
He leaned
forward, our
against the
chains
cold metal,
clinking in
his
rhythm
chest
with our
heaving as he
steps.
tried to catch his breath.
When my turn came,
The shadow's
the
presence had felt
grim-faced
wrong,
officer took my
like a
name,
violation of reality
issued me a
itself.
number, and handed
The
me a
next day,
threadbare
Victor sought
uniform
out Sergei
that
again.
smelled of mildew
The
and
older guard
despair.
was smoking a cigarette in the break room, his hands trembling slightly despite
Barracks
his calm
4
demeanor.
was a miserable structure.
I saw it.
Its wooden
Victor
walls
said,
warped
sitting
and
across
weathered
from
from
him.
years of exposure to
Sergei
the
didn't look
elements.
surprised.
Snow had drifted in through
The
gaps
shadow,
in the planks,
he said simply.
forming icy patches
Victor
on the
nodded,
floor.
his throat dry.
The air inside was heavy
is
with
it?
the stench of unwashed
Sergei
bodies
exhaled
and
a cloud of
rotting
smoke,
wood.
his expression grim.
Men lay on narrow
one knows
bunks,
for sure.
their faces hollow
Some
and
say
their
it's the
eyes
souls
vacant.
of the prisoners who died here,
They
trapped
didn't
in
look
the
up
darkness.
as I entered, but I could
Others
feel
think
their
it's older than the
stares,
prison itself.
their silent judgment.
Something that's always been here.
A voice
lurking in
said,
the cold.
startling me. I
Why
turned
doesn't
to see a
anyone do anything
wiry
about
man,
it? Victor
sitting
asked,
cross-legged
his
on a
frustration
bunk
mounting.
near the back of the room.
Sergei shook his head.
His eyes were sharp,
What can we do?
darting around the
The
room
walls
as
are
if he
built
were
to keep it out,
expecting something
but it finds ways in.
or someone.
It always does.
Mikhail, you're
That
new.
night, Victor couldn't
What's
shake
your
the
name?
feeling of impending
Pavel.
doom.
Pavel.
The prison
And you?
felt more oppressive
Mikhail.
than ever.
Mikhail,
Its silence heavy
let me
with
give you some
unspoken
advice,
fears.
Pavel. If you
As he
want to
prepared for his
survive this
shift,
place,
he found
keep your
himself
head
glancing
down and
over
your
his
mouth
shoulder,
shut.
half expecting to see
Pavel,
the shadow
thanks.
again.
I'll keep that in
The
mind.
east wing was quiet.
Mikhail
as he
chuckled,
patrolled,
a dry,
but the
humorless
stillness
sound.
only heightened his anxiety.
Mikhail. Oh, and
Every
one more
sound,
thing.
no matter how faint,
Whatever you
set
do,
his nerves on edge.
don't let them send you to the mines.
At one point, he thought he heard
Pavel,
whispers,
the mines.
soft,
Why?
indistinct voices,
His expression
coming from somewhere
darkened.
ahead.
Mikhail,
He
just
followed the
don't.
sound,
You'll find out
his
soon
flashlight
enough.
trembling in his hand.
Before I could press him
It led
further,
him
the
to an
door
old
creaked
storage
open
room,
and a guard
its door
stepped
hanging slightly
inside.
ajar.
Guard,
Inside, the air was colder
Lights
than the rest
out.
of the prison, and the
you
faint
start
scent of
work
decay
at dawn.
lingered,
The lanterns were extinguished,
shone his
plunging the
flashlight across the
barracks
room,
into darkness.
illuminating stacks of
I
rusted
lay on the
metal
hard
shelves
wooden
and
bunk,
broken
staring
furniture.
up at the ceiling as the cold
At
seeped
the
into
far
my
end,
bones.
something caught his eye. A pile
Outside,
of tattered clothes,
the wind howled,
stained and torn.
its
As he
mournful
moved
wail
closer,
sounding
he
almost
saw the
human.
scratch marks again.
As I
deep
drifted off to
grooves carved
sleep, I
into the
thought I heard
concrete
something
floor.
else.
His
A
stomach
faint
churned.
scratching sound coming from
Whatever
beneath
had
the
made those
floorboards.
marks wasn't human.
I told myself it was
A
just
sudden creak
rats.
behind him made him spin around, his flashlight sweeping the room.
Morning came too quickly.
For a moment, he thought
The
he saw a
guards
figure
marched us
standing
out
in the
into
doorway.
the snow, barking orders
A
as we
tall,
lined
dark
up for
shape
our
that
assignments.
seemed to flicker in and
The
out of
cold
existence.
was relentless, gnawing
But
at
when he
my
blinked,
fingers and toes.
it was gone.
Despite the pitiful excuse
Victor
for
backed
boots
out of the
we'd been
room,
given.
his
I was
heart
put on
racing.
rock hauling duty.
He returned to his
Back-breaking
quarters
task
and locked the
that
door,
left my muscles
his
screaming
mind
and my
racing
lungs burning.
with questions.
The hours blurred
The
together.
prison was hiding
a
something,
monotonous cycle of work,
something far worse
hunger, and exhaustion.
than the inmates it
As the
claimed to
days
contain.
passed, I began to
Following
notice
morning,
things.
Victor
Little
requested
things at
access to the
first.
prison's archives.
The way the guards avoided the
the
entrance
warden
to
was
the
reluctant,
mines.
but eventually
The way
agreed,
the other
handing
prisoners
him a key
whispered
to the
among
records room.
themselves when they thought no one was
Just
listening.
don't let this distract you from your duties.
Mikhail's warnings
the warden
echoed
said,
in my mind,
his
growing
tone
louder
stern.
with each passing day.
Victor spent hours
Then
coming
there were
through
the
old
nights.
reports and documents,
The scratching
piecing together
beneath the
fragments of the
floorboards
prison's
was becoming
history.
harder to ignore.
He learned that Site
It was
331
faint,
had been built during the
but
Soviet era,
persistent. A
ostensibly as
slow,
a high-security
rhythmic
facility
sound
for
that
political
seemed to
prisoners.
grow louder when the wind died
But there were
down.
whispers of another purpose.
I mentioned it to Mikhail
one that
once,
wasn't officially documented.
but he just shook his head.
One report detailed a mass
Mikhail, it's
escape
nothing.
attempt decades
Just
earlier.
rats.
30
it didn't
inmates had
sound
broken
like
out during a
rats.
polar night.
It
But
sounded
none had made it past the outer
deliberate,
walls.
like
Their
something
bodies were
trying
found
to
the
get
next
out.
morning. frozen solid and contorted in grotesque
One night,
positions.
I woke to find
The
Mikhail
report
sitting
included a
upright
chilling
on his
note.
bunk, his eyes wide and
The
unblinking.
walls are not to keep the prisoners
Mikhail,
in. They are
do
to
you hear
keep
that?
it out.
Pavel,
Victor's hands
Hear
trembled
what?
as he read the words.
Mikhail.
The shadow
The
wasn't
whispers.
just a ghost
They're
or a
getting
figment
louder.
of his imagination.
I strained my
It was
ears,
something
but all
real,
I could hear was the wind.
something the prison had been built to
Still,
contain.
the look in Mikhail's
But
eyes
now,
sent a shiver down my
it was
spine.
loose.
Whatever he was
That
hearing,
night,
it was
the
real to
prison
him.
descended into chaos,
And somehow
An
I knew
inmate
it was
found
only
dead
a
in the
matter of
cell,
time
his
before I
body
heard it
frozen,
too.
despite the heater running at full capacity. The other inmates refused to leave their cells, their fear palpable. Victor patrolled the halls, his nerves frayed. The whispers had returned, louder now, echoing through the corridors like a sinister chant. As he turned a corner, he saw it again. The shadow. It was larger this time, its form more defined. It moved toward him, silent and relentless, its presence overwhelming. Victor stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. The shadow loomed closer, its edges blurring and shifting like smoke. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving only silence. Victor stood frozen in the dim corridor, his flashlight still trembling in his grip. The shadow was gone, but its presence lingered, a suffocating weight that seemed to seep into the very walls of the prison. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he had just seen. Whatever the shadow was, it wasn't natural. It wasn't human. He stumbled back to the guard station, his legs unsteady beneath him. Sergei was there, his face pale and drawn, as though he had seen the same thing. "It's getting stronger," Sergei said quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights. Victor didn't reply. He sank into a chair, his hand shaking as he set the flashlight on the table. "What does it want?" he asked finally, his voice hoarse. Sergei shrugged, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. "Who knows? Maybe it doesn't want anything. Maybe it just exists. But I've seen it take people, guards, inmates. They vanish and no one ever talks about it. We just write a report and move on." Victor stared at him, the weight of those words settling heavily on his chest. "How do we stop it?" Sergei laughed bitterly, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "Stop it? You don't stop it. You survive it if you're lucky." The next day, Victor's unease grew unbearable. He couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was watching him, lurking just out of sight. The other guards seemed to feel it too. Their movements were hurried, their conversations hushed. Even the inmates, usually subdued, were restless, their eyes darting nervously toward the dark corners of their cells. That evening, Victor made his way to the records room again, desperate for answers. He combed through stacks of yellowed files and faded photographs, piecing together fragments of the prison's dark history. The deeper he dug, the more disturbing the picture became. The earliest records described strange phenomena dating back to the prison's construction. Workers disappearing, unexplained accidents, tools vanishing without a trace. One report from a Soviet-era scientist detailed an experiment conducted in the prison's East Wing. The notes were incomplete, but they hinted at something horrifying. A force they had tried to harness. Something that thrived in darkness and fed on fear. The experiment had been abandoned after several deaths, but the notes ended with a chilling warning. The darkness cannot be controlled. It is older than us, older than this place. Containment is our only hope. Victor sat back in his chair, the words echoing in his mind. Containment. The walls, the isolation. Everything about Site 331 was designed to keep the shadow from escaping. But something had changed. The containment was failing. That night, Victor was assigned to patrol the central yard again. The air was colder than usual, the snow crunching beneath his boots as he made his rounds. The yard lights cast long, jagged shadows across the ground, and Victor found himself glancing over his shoulders every few steps. The whispers started faintly at first, a low murmur that seemed to come from all directions. He stopped, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but the yard was empty. Then he saw it. The shadow was back, larger than before, its form writhing and shifting like a living thing. It moved toward him, silent and unstoppable. Victor's heart pounded as he raised his flashlight, the beam illuminating the edges of the shadow, but doing nothing to stop its advance. He stumbled backward, his breath fogging in the freezing air. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice cracking. The shadow didn't stop. It loomed over him, its presence overwhelming, and Victor felt a cold so deep it seemed to freeze his very soul. He turned and ran, his boots slipping on the icy ground as he made for the nearest door. He burst into the corridor, slamming the door shut behind him and collapsing against it. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, but the whispers followed him, growing louder. The shadow seeped through the cracks in the door, its form materializing in the dim light. Victor scrambled to his feet, his flashlight flickering as he backed away. "Help!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty halls. But no one came. The shadow moved closer, its edges blurring and shifting as though it were made of smoke. Victor felt his back hit the wall, the cold seeping into his skin. The shadow loomed over him, and he braced himself for the end. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The whispers ceased, leaving only silence. Victor stood there for a long moment, his body trembling, before collapsing to his knees. The next morning, Victor went straight to the warden's office. He burst through the door, his face pale and his eyes wide. "It's out of control," he said, his voice shaking. "We have to shut this place down." The warden looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "And where would we send the prisoners? Where would we send the guards? The shadow is bound to this place. If we leave, it will follow us. We can't stay here," Victor insisted. "Not after what I saw last night." The warden sighed, rubbing his temples. "We've known this day was coming. The containment is failing, but we have no choice. We have to keep it here, no matter the cost." Victor left the office, feeling more hopeless than ever. The warden's resignation was a death sentence, not just for the inmates, but for the guards as well. That night, the prison descended into chaos. The shadow was everywhere, moving through the halls like a living nightmare. Guards abandoned their posts, inmates screamed in their cells, and the whispers grew so loud they seemed to fill Victor's mind. He ran through the corridors, his flashlight barely holding back the encroaching darkness. The shadow followed him, relentless and unyielding. As he turned a corner, he collided with Sergei, who was pale and sweating. "We can't stop it," Sergei said, his voice cracking. "It's too strong." Victor grabbed him by the shoulders. "There has to be a way. The files mentioned containment. There must be something we can do." Sergei shook his head. "The only way to stop it is to sacrifice something. Someone. That's how they built the original containment. Blood for the darkness." Victor stared at him, the weight of those words crushing him. Before he could respond, the shadow surged forward, engulfing Sergei in an instant. Victor stumbled back, watching in horror as his colleague disappeared into the black void. He turned and ran, his mind racing. The sacrifice. It was the only way. He made his way to the control room, where the prison's main systems were housed. The shadow was close behind, its whispers deafening. Victor reached the main power controls and hesitated. Cutting the power would plunge the prison into total darkness, but it might also trap the shadow inside. He took a deep breath and pulled the lever. The lights went out, and the whispers ceased. For a moment, there was silence. Then the shadow rose, larger and more menacing than ever, its form consuming the entire corridor. Victor stood his ground, his heart pounding. "Take me," he said, his voice steady. "Let them go." The shadow paused, its edges rippling like water. Then it surged forward, engulfing Victor completely. The next morning, the prison was silent. The shadow was gone, and the inmates and guards who remained found no trace of Victor. In the control room, they found his flashlight and a single note scrawled on the wall. It is contained. For now.